Section 16 of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Silvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 16. A Drama at the Bercy Warehouse. Juve passed the whole day at the Cité Frochot. Despite the precautions to keep the failure 2 days back a secret, the papers had got wind of the drama. The Capital itself had spoken of it, though without naming his fellow worker. The staff of that paper was unaware that Fandor was the other man who had so marvellously escaped from the sewer. Blood-curdling tales were told about Dr. Chaleck, Juve, Loupart, the house of the crime, the affair at the hospital. But to anyone familiar with the actual happenings, the newspaper accounts were very far from giving the truth. And Juve, far from contradicting these misstatements, took a delight in spreading them broadcast. It is sometimes useful to set astray the powerful voice of the press, so as to give a false security to the real culprits. However, when masons, electricians, and zinc workers were seen to take possession of Dr. Chaleck's house and begin to turn it upside down, a crowd quickly assembled to witness the performance. It was with great difficulty that Juve, who did not want too many witnesses round the place, organised arrangements of a vigorous character. Installed in the drawing room on the ground floor, he first had a long interview with the owner of the house, Monsieur Nathan, the well-known diamond broker of the rue de Provence. The poor man was in despair to think his property had been the scene of the extraordinary events which were on everybody's tongue. All he knew of Dr. Chaleck was that that gentleman had been his tenant just 4 years, and had always paid his rent regularly. "You didn't suspect," asked Juve in conclusion, "the ingenious contrivance of the electric lift in which the doctor placed a study identically similar to the real one?" "Certainly not, sir," replied the worthy man. 18 months ago my tenant asked permission to repair the house at his own expense. As you may suppose, I granted his request at once. It must have been at that time that the queer contrivance was built. Have I your permission to go down to the cellars and ascertain their condition?" "Not before to morrow, sir, when I shall have finished my inspection," replied Juve, as he saw Monsieur Nathan out. The inspector was assisted in his investigation by detectives Michel and Dupassion. They interviewed the old couple in charge of the Cité and various neighbours of Dr. Chaleck, but without lighting upon a clue. Nobody had seen or heard anything whatever. Toward noon, he and Michel, who did not wish to leave the house, decided to have a modest repast brought to them. Monsieur Dupassion, a fidgety official, took this chance of getting away. "Well, gentlemen," he declared, "you are much more up to this business than I, and besides my wife expects me to luncheon. You don't need any further help from me?" Juve reassured the worthy superintendent, and gave him permission to go. He was only too glad to find himself alone with his lieutenant. The workmen who were repairing the caved-in basement of the little house were already gone, and there was no chance of their being back before 2 o'clock. Thus Juve found himself alone with Michel. "What I can't understand, sir," said Michel, "is the telephone call we got toward morning from here asking for help at the office in the rue Rochefoucauld. Either the victim herself 'phoned, and in that case she did not die, as we think, in the early part of the night, or it was not she, and then—" Juve smiled. "You are right in putting the problem that way, but to my mind it is easy to solve. The call was not given by the murdered woman, for, remember, when we raised the body at 6:30, it was already cold. Now the call was not given till 6, when the woman had been dead some little time. That I am sure of, and you will see the report of the medical expert will uphold me." "Then it was a third person who gave it?" "Yes, and one who sought to have the crime discovered as soon as possible, and who reckoned on the officers coming from the central station, but did not expect Fandor or me to come back." "Then, according to you, sir, the murderer knew of your presence behind the curtain in the study while the crime was being committed?" "I can't tell about the murderer, but Dr. Chaleck certainly knew we were there. That man must have watched us all night, known the exact instant we left the house, and immediately afterwards got someone to telephone, or must have done so himself." Michel, becoming more and more convinced by Juve's reasoning, went on: "At any rate, the existence of two studies, in all respects similar, goes to show a carefully premeditated plan, but there is something I can't account for. When you came back to the study where we found the dead woman, you found traces of mud by the window brought in by your shoe. You must therefore have been watching through the night the room where the crime was committed." Juve was about to put in a word, but Michel, launched on his train of argument, continued: "Allow me, sir. You are going, no doubt, to tell me that they might, during your short absence, have carried the body of the victim into the study in question. But I would point out to you that on the loosened hair of the poor creature blood had caked, that some was on the carpet, and had even gone through it to the flooring beneath. Now, if they carried in the body just a little while before we discovered it, that would not have been the case." Michel was delighted with his own argument. Juve smiled indulgently. "My poor Michel," he cried, "you would be quite right if I put forward such an explanation. It is certain that the room in which we found the body was that in which the crime took place. It is therefore that in which we were not. As for the marks of mud near the window, they are ours, but transferred from the room in which we were into the room in which we were not, which again proves that our presence was known to the culprits. Furthermore, the candle with which Dr. Chaleck melted the wax to seal his letters was scarcely used. It only burned, in fact, a few minutes. Now we found another candle in the same state. So you see that the precautions were well taken and everything possible done to lead us astray. We see the puppets moving, Loupart, Chaleck, Josephine, others maybe, but we do not see the strings." "The strings which move them, perhaps, may be no farther than Fantômas," ventured Michel. Juve frowned and suddenly fell silent, then abruptly changed the conversation. He asked his lieutenant: "You told me, did you not, that you could no longer appear in the character of the sapper?" "Quite true, Inspector. I was spotted just the day before the crime by Loupart, and so was my colleague, Nonet." "Talking of that," answered Juve, "Nonet mentioned vaguely something about an affair at the docks, supposed to have been planned by the Beard and an individual known as the Cooper. Are you fully informed?" "Unfortunately, no, Inspector. I know no more about the matter than you do." "And what is Nonet about now?" "He has left for Chartres." Juve shrugged his shoulders. He was annoyed. Perhaps if Léon, nicknamed Nonet, had not been transferred, he would by now have obtained pertinent clues to the docks affair. After having enjoined Michel to devise a new disguise which allowed him to mix once more with the band of cyphers, and going back to the Good Comrades, Juve went down to the basement to supervise the workmen, who were now back, while Michel busied himself with the inventory of the papers found in Dr. Chaleck's study. On leaving the house toward 7:30 in the evening, Juve went slowly down to the rue des Martyrs, pondering over the occurrences which for several days had succeeded each other with such startling rapidity. As he reached the boulevards, the bawling of newsboys attracted his attention. An ominous headline was displayed in the papers the crowd was struggling for: "Another railroad accident! The Simplon Express telescopes the Marseille Limited. Many victims!" Juve anxiously bought a paper and scanned the list of the injured, fearful that Fandor would be found among the number. But as he read the details and learned that those in the detached carriage had escaped, he felt somewhat relieved. Hailing a taxi, he drove off rapidly to the Prefecture in search of more precise information. "A message for you, Monsieur Juve." The detective, hurrying home, was passing the porter's lodge. He pulled up short. "For me?" "Yes, it's certainly your name on the telegram." Juve took the blue envelope with distrust and uneasiness. He had given his home address to no one. He glanced over the message and gave a sigh of relief. "The dear fellow!" he muttered as he went upstairs. "He's had a narrow escape. However, all's well that ends well." After a hurried toilet and a bite of dinner, Juve set off again, jumped into a train for the Boulevard Saint Germain, and got down at the Jardin des Plantes. Then, sauntering casually along, he made for Bercy by the docks, which were covered as far as the eye could see with rows and rows of barrels. About 2 hours later, Juve, who had been wandering about the vast labyrinth of wine docks, began to grow impatient. It was already 50 minutes past the appointed hour, and the detective began to feel uneasy. Why was Fandor so late? Something must surely have happened to him. And then what a queer idea to choose such a meeting place! Suddenly Juve started. He recalled his talk that afternoon with Michel, the reference made to the affair of the docks, in which Beard and the cooper were implicated. What if he had been drawn into a trap? The detective's reflections were suddenly cut short by unusual and alarming sounds. He fancied he heard the shrill blast of a whistle, followed by the rush of footsteps and a collision of empty barrels. Juve held his breath, and crouched down under the shed in which he stood. He thought he saw the outline of a shadow passing slowly in the distance. Juve was stealthily following in its tracks, when he caught a significant click. "Two can play at that," he growled between his teeth, as he cocked his revolver. The shadow disappeared, but the footsteps went on. Disguising his voice, he called out: "Who goes there?" A sharp summons answered him: "Halt!" Juve was about to call upon his mysterious neighbour to do likewise, when a report rang out, at once followed by another. Juve saw where the shots came from. His assailant was scarcely 15 paces from him, but luckily the shots had gone wide. "Use up your cartridges, my friend," muttered Juve. "When you get to number 6, it will be my turn." The 6th shot rang out. This was the signal for Juve to spring forward. Leaping over the barrels, he made for the shadow, which he espied at intervals. All at once he gave a cry of triumph. He was face to face with a man. His cry, however, changed to amazement. "You, Fandor?" "Juve!" "You've been shooting at me, have you?" For answer, the journalist held out his revolver, which was fully loaded. "But what are you doing here, Juve?" he asked. "You wired me to come." "That I never did." Juve drew the telegram from his pocket and held it out to Fandor. But as the two men drew close together, they were startled by a lightning flash and a report. A bullet whistled past their ears. Instinctively they lay flat between two barrels, holding their breaths. Juve whispered instructions: "When I give the signal, fire at anything you see, or toward the direction of the next report." The two men slowly and noiselessly raised their heads. "Ah!" cried Juve, and he fired at the rapidly fleeing figure. "Did you see?" whispered Fandor, clutching Juve's arms. "It's Chaleck." Juve was about to leap up and start in pursuit, when a series of dull thuds, the overturning of barrels, stifled oaths, and cracking planks smote his ear. These noises were followed by the measured footfall of a body of men drawing near, words of command and shrill whistles. "What's all that now?" questioned Fandor. "The best thing that could happen to us," replied Juve. "The police are coming. These quays are a refuge for all kinds of tramps and crooks who from time to time are rounded up. We are probably going to see a drive." Juve had scarcely finished speaking when several shots rang out. These were followed by a general uproar, and then a great blue flame suddenly rose, died away, and flared up again. A thick smoke permeated the atmosphere. "Fire!" exclaimed Fandor. "The kegs of alcohol are alight," added Juve. The two had now to think of their own safety. Evidently, bandits had been tracking them for more than an hour, guided by Dr. Chaleck. But they soon found their retreat was cut off by a ring of flames. "Let us head for the Seine," suggested Fandor, who had discovered a break in the ring of fire at that point. A fresh explosion now took place. From a burst cask a spurt of liquid fire shot up, closing the circle. It had become impossible to pass through in any direction. They heard the cries of the rabble, the whistles of the officers. In the distance the horns of the fire engines moaned dolefully. The heat was growing unbearable, and the ring enclosing Fandor and Juve narrowed more and more. Suddenly Juve pointed to an enormous empty puncheon that had just rolled beside them. "Have you ever looped the loop?" he asked. "Hurry up now, in you go! We'll let it roll down the slope of the quay into the river." In a few moments the cask was rolling at top speed. Juve and Fandor guessed by the crackling of the outer planks, and by a sudden rise in the temperature, that they were passing through the fire. All at once the great vat reached the level of the river. It plunged into the waves with a dull thud. End of Chapter 16. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com 17 of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 17. On the Slabs of the Morgue. As he turned at the far side of the Pont Saint Louis, Dr. Ardel, the celebrated medical jurist, caught sight of Monsieur Fuselier, the magistrate, chatting with Inspector Juve in front of the morgue. "I am behindhand, gentlemen. So sorry to have made you wait." Monsieur Fuselier and Juve crossed the tiny court and entered the semicircular lecture room, where daily lessons in medical jurisprudence are given to the students and the head men of the detective police force. Dr. Ardel, piloting his guests, did the honours. "The place is not exactly gay. In fact, it has an ill reputation. But anyhow, gentlemen, it is at your disposition. Monsieur Fuselier, you will be able to investigate in peace. Monsieur Juve, you will be at liberty to put any questions you choose to your client." The doctor spoke in a loud voice, emphasizing each word with a jolly laugh, good-natured, devoid of malice, yet making an unpleasant impression on his two visitors, less at home than he in the gruesome abode they had just entered. "You will excuse me," he went on, "if I leave you for a couple of minutes to put on an overall and my rubber gloves?" The doctor gone, the two instinctively felt a vague need to talk, to counteract the doleful atmosphere the morgue seemed to exhale, where so many unclaimed corpses, so much human flotsam had come to sleep under the inquiring eyes of the crowd, before being given to the common ditch, being no more than an entry in a register and a date. Body found so and so, buried so and so. "Tell me, my dear Juve," asked Monsieur Fuselier, "this morning, directly I got your message, I at once acceded to your wish, and asked Ardel to have us both here this afternoon. But I hardly understand your object. What have you come here for?" Juve, with both hands in his pockets, was walking up and down before the dissecting table. At the magistrate's question he stopped short, and, turning to Monsieur Fuselier, replied: "Why have I come here? I scarcely know myself. It's everything or nothing, the key to the puzzle. I tell you, Monsieur Fuselier, things are becoming increasingly tragic and baffling." "How's that?" "The part played by Josephine is less and less clear. She is Loupart's mistress. She informs against him, is fired at by him, then, according to Fandor, becomes in some manner his accomplice in a robbery so daring that you must search the annals of American criminality to find its like." "You refer to the train affair?" "Yes. Now, leaving Josephine on one side, we are confronted with two enigmas. Dr. Chaleck, a man of the world, a scholar, crops up as leader of a band of criminals. What we know for certain about him is that he fired at Josephine, that he was concerned in the affair of the docks, no more. There remains Loupart, and about him being the real culprit we know nothing. There is no proof that he killed the woman. In order to prove that, we should have to know who that woman is, and why she was killed, and also how. The how and why of the crime alone might chance to give us the answer." "What trail are you following?" "That of the dead woman. The body we are about to examine will determine me in which quarter to direct my search." Monsieur Fuselier, looking at the detective with a penetrating eye, asked: "You surely haven't the notion of suspecting Fantomas?" "You are right, Monsieur Fuselier," he replied. "Behind Loupart, behind Chaleck, everywhere and always, it is Fantomas I am looking for." Whatever information the detective was about to impart to the magistrate was cut short by the return of Dr. Ardel. That gentleman, in donning the uniform of the expert, had resumed an appearance of professional gravity. "We are going to work now, gentlemen," he announced. "I need not remind you, of course, that the body you are about to see, that of the woman found in the Cité Frochot, has already undergone certain changes due to decomposition, which have modified its aspect." So saying, Dr. Ardel pressed a button and gave an attendant the necessary order: "Be so good as to bring the body from room number 6." Some minutes later a folding door in the wall opened, and two men pushed a truck into the middle of the hall, upon which lay the corpse of the unknown. "I now give over the dead woman to you to identify," declared Dr. Ardell. "My examination has been carried out, and my part as expert is over. I am ready to hand in my report." Fuselier and Juve bent long over the slab upon which the body had been placed. "Alas!" cried Juve, "how recognise anything in this countenance destroyed by pitch? What discover in these crushed limbs, this human form, which is now a shapeless mass?" And, turning to Dr. Ardell, he questioned: "Professor, what did you learn from your autopsy?" "Nothing, or very little," replied the doctor. "Death was not due to one blow more than another. A general effusion of blood took place everywhere at once." "Everywhere at once? What do you mean by that?" questioned Juve. "Gentlemen, that is the exact truth. In dissecting this body, I was surprised to find all the blood vessels burst: the heart, the veins, the arteries, even the lung cells. More than this, the very bones are broken, splintered into a vast number of little pieces. Lastly, both on the limbs and over the whole body, I find a general ecchymosis, reaching from the top of the neck to the lower extremities." "But," objected Juve, who feared the Professor might linger over technical details too complex for him, "what general notion does this suggest to you as the cause of death?" "A strange idea, Monsieur Juve, and one it is not easy for me to define. You might say that the body of this woman had passed under the grinders of a roller. The body is rolled, that is just the word, crushed all over, and there is no point where the pressure might be conjectured to have been greatest." Monsieur Fuselier looked at Juve. "What can we deduce from that?" he asked. "Professor Ardell demonstrates scientifically the same doubts to which a rough inspection led me. How did the murderer go to work? It becomes more and more of a mystery." "It is so much so," declared Professor Ardell, "that even by postulating the worst complications, I really cannot conceive of any machine capable of thus crushing a human being." "I see and do not believe," declared the magistrate, "that we have any more to see here. It is plain, Juve, that this corpse cannot furnish any clues to you and me for the inquest." "The corpse, no," cried Juve, "but there is something else." Then, turning to the Professor, he asked: "Could you have brought to us the clothes this woman wore?" "Quite easily." From a bag that an attendant handed him, Juve drew out the garments of the dead woman. The shoes were by a good maker, the silk stockings with open work embroidery, the chemise and the drawers were of fine linen, and the corset was well cut. "Nothing!" he cried. "Not a mark on this linen, or even the name of the shop where it was bought." He examined her petticoat, her bodice, a sort of elegant blouse, trimmed with lace, and the velvet collar, which had several spots of blood upon it. He then drew a small penknife from his pocket, and, kneeling on the floor, proceeded to probe the seams. Suddenly he uttered a muffled exclamation: "Ah! What's this?" From the lining of the bodice he drew out a thin roll of paper, crumpled, stained with blood, torn unfortunately. "Goodness of God, in whom I trust, I do not wish to die with this remorse. I do not wish to risk his killing me to destroy this secret. I write this confession. I will tell him it is deposited in a safe place. Yes, I was the cause of the death of that hapless actor. Yes, Valgrand paid for the crime which Gurn committed. Yes, I sent Valgrand to the scaffold by making him pass for Gurn, Gurn who killed Lord Beltham, Gurn who, I sometimes think, must be Fantomas." Juve read these lines in an agitated voice, and as he came to the signature he turned pale and was obliged to stop. "What is the matter?" "It is signed Lady Beltham." In order that Dr. Ardell, understanding nothing of Juve's agitation, might grasp that import of the paper just discovered, he would have had to call to mind the appalling tragedy which 3 years before had stirred the whole world with its bloody vicissitude and mystery, one not solved to that hour. "Lady Beltham?" At that name Juve called up the whole blood-curdling past. He saw in fancy the English lady whose husband was murdered by the Canadian Gurn, who was perhaps her lover. And Juve, following his train of thought, pondered that he had accused this same lady of having, to save her lover, the very day the guillotine was erected on the boulevard, found means to send in his stead the innocent actor Valgrand. And here, in connection with this affair of the Cité Frochot, he found Lady Beltham involved in the puzzle of which he was so keenly seeking the key. Juve again read the momentous paper he had just unearthed. "By Jove, it was plain," ran his thought. "The lady, criminal though she might be, was first and foremost Fantômas' passionate inamorata, and this paper he held in his hands was the tail end of her confession, the remains of a document in which in a fit of moral distress she had avowed her remorse and made known the truth." And, taking line by line the cryptic statement, Juve asked himself further: "What do these phrases signify? How extract the whole truth from these few words? I do not want him to kill me in order to destroy that secret. When Lady Beltham wrote that, she was angry with Gurn. Then, again, what did this other doubtful expression mean? Gurn, who I sometimes fancied may be Fantômas. She did not know, then, the precise identity of her lover. Oh, the wretch! To what depths had she sunk?" Then, as he put this query to himself, Juve shook from head to foot. Like a thunderclap, he thought he grasped the truth he had followed so eagerly. What had become of Lady Beltham? Must he not come to the conclusion that this woman whose face had been crushed out of all recognition by the murderer was none other than the lady? How else explain the discovery in her bodice of the betraying document? Who but she could have had it in her possession? Who else could have so sedulously concealed it? Juve read over another clause. "I will tell him it is deposited in a safe place." Feverishly, Juve took up the garments trailing on the ground, and carefully explored the fabric, made a minute search. "It is impossible," he thought, "that I should not find another document, the beginning of this confession. I must have it." All at once he stopped short in his search. "Curse it all!" And he pointed out to Monsieur Fuselier, disguised in the lining of a loose pocket in the petticoat, a fresh hiding place, but torn and, alas, empty. This woman had split up her confession into several portions, and if she was killed, it was certainly to strip her of these compromising papers. Well, the murderer had attained his object. "Look, Fuselier, this empty cache is the proof of what I put forward, and chance alone allowed the page concealed in the collar of this bodice to fall into my hands." Long did the detective still grope and ponder, heedless of the questions the Professor and the magistrate kept asking him. He rose at last, and with a distracted gesture took the arm of Monsieur Fuselier, and dragged him before the stone slab on which the corpse, but recently unknown, smiled a ghastly smile. "Monsieur Fuselier, the dead woman has spoken. She is Lady Beltham. This is the body of Lady Beltham." The magistrate recoiled in horror. He murmured: "But who, then, can Dr. Chaleck be? Who can Loupart be?" Juve replied without hesitation: "Ask Fantomas the names of his accomplices." And leaving him and Dr. Ardel without any farewell, Juve rushed from the morgue, his features so distorted that as they passed him people drew aside, amazed and murmuring: "A madman or a murderer!" End of Chapter 17. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 18. Fantomas Victim. "You understand my object, Fandor? Hitherto I have worked unaided. I wanted to unearth Fantomas and bring him to headquarters, saying to my superiors: 'For 3 years you have maintained this man was dead. Well, here he is. I have put the darbies on the most terrible ruffian of modern times. Well, I must forego my little triumph. We must now work in the open. Public opinion must come to our aid.'" "Then you want me to write my article?" "Yes, and tell all the details. Wind up by putting the question squarely: Is not Fantomas still alive? Then sum up in the affirmative. Now be off.
I want to read your article this evening in the Capital."
Fandor had just left his detective friend when old Jean, the only servant that Juve tolerated in his private quarters, entered the room. "Don't forget the person who is waiting in the parlour, sir."
"Ah, yes, to be sure. A person who comes to see me at home when nobody knows my address should be interesting. Show him in, Jean."
Juve placed his revolver in reach of his hand as Jean announced: "Maître Gérin, notary." Juve rose, motioned his visitor to a chair, and inquired the object of his visit. Maître Gérin bowed respectfully to Juve. "I must apologize," he said, "for coming to disturb you at home, sir, but it concerns a matter of such importance, and it involves names so terrible, that I could not utter them within the walls of the Sûreté. What brings me here is a crime which must be laid to Fantomas or his heirs in crime." Juve was strongly moved.
"Speak, sir, I am all attention."
"Monsieur Juve, I believe that one of my clients, a woman, has been killed. I have had for some time a certain sympathy, and, I don't disguise it, an immense curiosity concerning her because she was actually involved in the mysterious affairs of Fantomas."
"The name of the woman, Counsel? Her name, I beg of you?"
"The name of the woman who, I fear, has been murdered is Lady Beltham." Juve gave a sigh of relief. It was the name he wished to hear. Maître Gérin continued: "I have been Lady Beltham's lawyer for a long period of time, but since the Fantomas case came to an end in the sentencings to death of Gurn, and the subsequent scandal attached to the name of Lady Beltham, I have ceased to have any further tidings of that unhappy woman. Indirectly, through the medium of the papers, which at times gave out some echo of her, I knew that she had been travelling, then that she was back in Paris, and had gone to live at Neuilly, Boulevard Inkermann. But I did not see her again. It is true her family matters were settled, her husband's estate entirely wound up. In short, she had no reason to appeal to me professionally."
"To be sure."
"Well, some days ago, I was greatly surprised by her visiting my office. Naturally, I refrained from asking her any awkward questions." Juve interrupted:
"In heaven's name, sir, how long ago is it since Lady Beltham called on you?"
19 days, sir." A sigh of relief escaped Juve. He had feared all his theories regarding the body at the morgue the day before were going to collapse.
"Go on, sir," he cried.
"Lady Beltham, on being shown into my private office, appeared to me much the same physically as I had known her previously. But she was no longer the great lady, cold, haughty, a trifle disdainful. She seemed crushed under a terrible load, a prey to awful mental torture. She made appeal to my discretion, both professionally and as a man of honour. She then spoke as follows: 'I am going to write a letter which, if it fell into the hands of a third person, would bring about a great calamity. This letter I shall entrust to you together with my will, which will instruct you what to do with it at my death. I will send you a visiting card with a line in my own handwriting every fortnight. If ever this card fails to come, conclude that I am dead, that they have murdered me, and carry that letter where I tell you. Avenge me!'"
"Well, what then?"
cried Juve anxiously. "That is all, Monsieur Juve. I have not seen Lady Beltham again, nor had any news of her. When I called her residence, I was told she was away. I have come to ask you whether you think she has been murdered." Juve was pacing his room with great strides.
"Maître," he said at last, "your story confirms all I have suspected. Yes, Lady Beltham is dead. She has been murdered. That letter contained her confession, and revealed not only her own crimes, but those of her accomplices, of her master, of Fantomas. Fantomas killed her to free himself of a witness to his evil life."
"Fantomas? But Fantomas is dead."
"So they say."
"Have you proofs of his existence?"
"I am looking for them."
"What do you think of doing?"
"I am going to make an investigation. I am going to learn where and how Lady Beltham was killed. I shall see you again, Maître. Read The Capital this evening. You will find in it many interesting surprises."
End of Chapter 18. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Of The Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 19. The Englishwoman of Boulevard Inkermann. To sum up what I have just learned. Juve was seated at his desk, and those who knew the private life of the great detective would assuredly have guessed that he was gravely preoccupied. He was trying to extract some useful information from the notary's visit, some hints essential to the investigation he had taken in hand and that at all hazards he meant to pursue to a successful termination. The task was fraught with difficulties and even peril, but the triumph would be great if he should succeed in putting the bracelets on the genius of crime, as he had called him to his friend Fandor. Lady Beltham had gone to visit Gérin. She was an astute woman after all, and knew how to get her own way. There must have been powerful motives which urged her to write that confession. What were those motives? Remorse? No, a woman who loves has no remorse. Fear? Probably, but fear of what? Juve, without being aware of it, had just written on the paper of his notebook the ill-omened name which haunted him. Fantomas! Why, of course, Fantômas killed Lady Beltham and killed her in the house of Dr. Chaleck, an accomplice. And Loupart, a third accomplice, got his mistress to write to me, and I believed the denunciation. Loupart got us to dog him, led me unawares behind the curtains in the study, and made me witness that Chaleck was innocent. Oh, the ruse was a clever one. Josephine herself, by the 2 shots she received some days later at La Reboussée, became a victim. In short, the scent was crossed and broken. The detective snatched up his hat, saw carefully to the charges of his pocket revolver, then gravely and solemnly cried: "It is you and I now, Fantomas," with which he left his rooms. Juve and Fandor were entering a taxicab. "To Neuilly Church," cried Juve to the driver. "And now, my dear Fandor, you must be thinking me crazy, as less than 2 hours ago I sent you off to write an article, and here I come taking you from your paper and carrying you away in this headlong fashion. But just listen to the tale of this morning's doings." Juve then gave a full account of Maître Gérin's visit, and wound up by saying: "It is through Lady Beltham that we must unearth that monster, Fantomas." "That's all very well," replied Fandor, "but as the lady is dead, how are we going to set about it?" "By reconstructing the last hours of her life. We are now on our way to Lady Beltham's residence, Boulevard Inkermann." "And what are we to do when we arrive there?" "I shall examine the house, which is probably empty, and you are to pump the neighbours, to ask questions of the tradespeople. I should attract too much attention if I were to do this myself, and that is why I dragged you away from your work." Some moments later, the taxi pulled up at the corner of Boulevard Inkermann. "The house is number..." said Juve as he took Fandor by the arm. "Bless me, you remember that house. It is the one in which I arrested Gurn 3 years ago, that famous day he came to see Lady Beltham, disguised as a beggar." The two friends soon found themselves at their destination. Through the garden railing, which was wholly covered with a dense growth of ivy, the two saw the house, which now looked very dilapidated. "It doesn't look as if it had been inhabited for a long while," said Fandor. "That's what we want to make sure of. Go and make your inquiries." Fandor left his companion and made his way back to the commercial section of Neuilly. He stopped opposite a sign which read: "Gardening done." "Anyone there?" he inquired. An old woman, standing in the doorway, came forward. "What can I do for you, sir?" "If I am not mistaken, it was you who attended to Lady Beltham's garden?" "Yes, sir. We kept her garden in order, but my husband hasn't worked there for several months, as Lady Beltham has been away." "I heard she was coming back to Paris, and called to day, but found the house closed up." "Oh, I am sorry. Lady Beltham's an excellent customer, and Madame Raymond also bought flowers of us." "Madame Raymond? She is a friend of Lady Beltham?" "Her companion. It is now close to a year that Madame Raymond has been living with her. Oh, a very pleasant lady, a pretty brunette, very elegant, and not at all proud." Fandor thought it well not to seem astonished.
"Oh yes, of course," he cried. "Madame Raymond, I remember now. Lady Beltham's life is so sad and lonely." "True enough," the woman replied, and lowering her voice, "and then, what with all these tales of noises and ghosts, the house can't be too pleasant to live in, eh?" Fandor pretended to be well posted. "People still talk of these incidents?" "Oh yes, sir." Fandor did not venture to press the subject, and, taking leave of the worthy woman, he made his way back to the boulevard. As soon as Juve caught sight of him in the distance, he ran up eagerly. "Well?" "Well, Juve, what have you found out during my absence?" "In the first place, that it is exactly 64 days since Lady Beltham left Neuilly. I discovered this by the dates on a lot of circulars in the letter box. I also had a talk with a butcher's man, and learned that Lady Beltham had a companion." "Oh, I was bringing you that same news." "This Madame Raymond is young, dark, very pretty. Can't you guess who she is?" Fandor stared at Juve. "You mean?" "Josephine. It's perfectly clear. We know Lady Beltham wrote a confession, that Fantomas suspected this and murdered her to get hold of it, and further, that in this murder Loupart was involved. Josephine was introduced to Lady Beltham by Fantomas, a spy going there to betray the great lady and possibly entice her later to the Cité for show. Let us make haste, lad. We thought we had to follow the trail of Loupart and Chaleck, but we mustn't lose sight of Josephine. She may be the means of helping us to the truth." End of chapter 19. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com.
Of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Silvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 20. The Arrest of Josephine. The somewhat grim faces of Mesdames Guinon, Julie, and the Flirt lit up suddenly. Bonzille, the tramp, set free by the police the day after the drive in the rue Charbonnier, had opened the bottle of vermouth, and Josephine bustled around to find glasses to put on the table. Josephine had visitors in her little lodging. There was to be a quiet lunch. On the sideboard attractive dishes were ready. A fine savour of cooking onions came from the dark corner in which Loupart's pretty mistress was doing hasty cookery over the gas. "Neat or with water?" asked Bonzille, performing his office of cup-bearer with comic dignity. Madame Guinon asked for plenty of water. Julie shrugged her shoulders indifferently. She didn't care so long as there was drink, while the Flirt, in her cracked voice, breathed in the loafer's ear, "How about a sip of brandy to put with it?" The appetizer loosened tongues. They began to cackle. From a drawer, Josephine got out a pack of cards, which the Flirt promptly seized, while Julie, leaning familiarly on her shoulder, counselled her. "Cut with the left, and watch what you're doing. We shall see if there's any luck for us in the pack." Josephine had now been back 3 days from her painful journey, and had not seen Loupart. The latter, after having abandoned the motor in some waste ground among the fortifications, had vanished with the beard, only bidding his mistress go home as if nothing had happened, and wait for news of him. The Simplon Express affair had made a great stir in the fashionable world, and had produced considerable uneasiness among the criminal class. To be sure, no name had been mentioned, and apparently the police were not following any definite clue. Still, in the Chapelle quarter, and especially in the den of the Goutte d'Or and the rue de Chartres, it was noticed that the absence of the chief members of the band of cyphers coincided with the date of the tragedy. At first there had been some slight standoffishness shown to Josephine on her return. She was greeted with doubtful allusions, equivocal compliments, and a touch of coldness, and folks were also amazed at not seeing Loupart reappear with her. Josephine told herself that she must at all costs disabuse her neighbours of this bad impression, and that is why she had decided to give a luncheon party to her most intimate friends. These might also be her most formidable opponents, for such damsels as the Flirt and Julie, Even big Ernestine could not fail to be jealous of the mistress of a distinguished leader. Besides, she was the prettiest woman in the quarter. Joining the conversation from time to time, Josephine smiled and regained confidence. Her maneuver bade fair to be crowned with success. As they sat down to table, the door opened, and Mother Toulouche came in, carrying a capacious basket.
"Well," cried the old fence, "I got wind that something was going on here, and I said to myself, why shouldn't Mother Toulouche be in it as well? One more or less don't matter, eh, Josephine?"
Josephine assented and made room for her. Before sitting down, the old woman put her basket on the floor.
"If I invite myself, Fifine, I bring something to the feast. Here are some Portugals and 24 snails, which will help out."
All at once Josephine, who despite general gaiety was absent-minded and preoccupied, rose and ran to the door, answering a knock. She was at bottom horribly uneasy at hearing nothing of her lover. She began to fear that the police for once might have got the upper hand. It was little Palot, the porter's son, who rushed in quite out of breath.
"Madame Josephine, Mother told me to come up and warn you that 2 gentlemen were asking for you in the lodge just now. 2 gentlemen in special rig."
"Do you know them, Palot?"
"I don't, Madame Josephine."
"What did they want of me?"
"They didn't say."
"What did your mother answer?"
"Don't know. Believe she told them you were in your den."
The occurrence cast a chill over the company. Little Palot was given a big glass of claret, and when he had left, the Flirt observed gravely: "It's the cops."
"Why should they come and inquire for me?"
Julie tried to console her.
"Anyhow, they'll not come up to your place."
Josephine was greatly upset. Were they after her or Loupart? Why had they withdrawn? Would they come back? In a flash she burst out, beating her fist on the table:
"Bah! I've had enough of this, not knowing what is going to happen from one moment to the next. Sooner than stay here, I'll go and find out."
The Flirt suggested, with a spiteful smile:
"Go ahead, my girl. They won't be far away. Go and ask them what they want."
"Very well,"
cried Josephine, "I will."
And the young girl emptied her glass to give her courage.
"And if you don't come back, we'll set your room to rights,"
cried the Flirt after her.
"Good luck. Try and not sleep in the jug."
Josephine rushed downstairs, and then, after a moment's hesitation, turned and went down to the rue de Chartres. At first she noticed nothing unusual or suspicious. The faces of those she met were mostly familiar to her. But suddenly her heart stopped beating. 2 men accosted her simultaneously, one on her right, the other on her left. Her neighbour on the right asked very softly: "Are you Josephine Ramot?"
"Yes."
"You must come with us."
"Yes,"
said Josephine, resigned. A few moments later, Josephine, seated in a cab between the 2 men, was crossing Paris. The detectives had given the address: Boulevard du Palais. Loupart's mistress, taken on her arrival to the anteroom adjoining the private rooms of the examining magistrates, had not much time for reflection. To be sure, she was not guilty. Not guilty? Well, at bottom the affair of the Marseilles train made Josephine uneasy. And the story of the motor, too, the motor taken by force from unknown travellers. What knowledge had the police of these events? One question: was she to confess or to deny? A little old man, bald and fussy, appeared at the end of the passage and called her:
"Josephine Ramot, the private room of Justice Fuselier."
Mechanically she went forward between her 2 captors, who pushed her into a well-lit apartment, in the corner of which stood a big desk. A well-dressed gentleman was sitting there, writing. Opposite him, in the shadow, someone stood motionless. The magistrate raised his head. His face was cold and contained, but not spiteful. "What is your name?"
"Josephine Ramot."
"Where were you born?"
"Rue de Belleville."
"What is your age?"
22.
"You live by prostitution?" Josephine coloured, and with an angry voice cried:
"No, your Honour, I have a calling. I am a polisher."
"Are you working now?" Josephine felt awkward.
"Well, to say the truth, at the moment I have no work, but they know me at Monsieur Montier's, Rue de Malte. It was there I was apprenticed, and..."
"And since you became the mistress of the ruffian Loupart, known as the Square, you have ceased to practise an honest calling?"
I won't deny being Loupart's mistress, but as for prostitution..." The man Josephine had noticed standing in the shadow came forward and murmured a few words in the magistrate's ear. "Monsieur Juve!" cried Josephine, moving toward the inspector with her hand out. She stopped short as the detective motioned to her that such a familiarity was not allowable, and the examination was resumed. The magistrate, after having by some curt questions brought to light the salient points of Josephine's life, and clearly mapped out the speedy development of the honest little work girl into a ruffian's mistress, and, in all probability, accomplice, began the interrogation on the main point. At some length he narrated, without losing a single change of her countenance, the various incidents of the evening begun in the railway, which ended with the disaster to the Simplon Express. Fuselier made Josephine pass again through her headlong exit from La Reboussée, her quick passage through Paris when she was barely convalescent and still suffering from the effects of the fever, her departure in the Marseilles Express, where she picked up half a score of footpads headed by her redoubtable lover, then the waiting in the silence of the night, the affray, the threats, and lastly, after breaking the couplings to the train, the dangerous flight of the band, the headlong rush through the country. The magistrate wound up. "You came to town afterwards, Josephine Ramot, in company with Loupart, called the Square, and his factotum, the ruffian Beard." Josephine, embarrassed by the steady glance of the magistrate, endeavoured to keep her face devoid of expression; but as in his recital the points of the adventure she had shared grew more definite, she felt she was constantly changing colour, and at certain moments her eyelids quivered over her downcast eyes. Evidently he was well posted. That young man who got into the same compartment as Monsieur Martial must certainly have belonged to the police. But for that, the judge would never have known precisely what took place. Decidedly, this was a bad beginning. Josephine now dreaded to see the door open and Loupart appear, the bracelets on his wrists, followed by the Beard, similarly fettered, for beyond a doubt the two men had been nabbed. Hunched up, her nerves tense, Josephine kept her mind fixed on one point. She was waiting anxiously for the first chance to protest. At a certain juncture the magistrate declared: "You three, Loupart, the Beard, and yourself, shared between you the proceeds of the robberies committed." As soon as she could get a word in, Josephine shouted her innocence. Oh, as to that, no, she had not touched a cent from the business. She did not even know what was involved. The exact truth was this: she was ill in the hospital when all of a sudden she remembered that Loupart had some days before bidden her to be at all costs at the Lyons station on a certain Saturday evening at exactly 7 o'clock. Now that particular Saturday was the day after the attempt on her life. As she was much better, she set off in obedience to her lover. She knew no more, she had done no more, she would not have them accuse her of any more. The young woman had gradually grown warm, her voice rose and vibrated. The judge let her have her say, and when she had finished, there was a silence. Monsieur Fuselier slowly dipped a pen in the ink, and in his level voice declared, casting a glance in Juve's direction: "After all, what seems clearly established is complicity." Josephine gave a start. She knew the terrible significance of the term. Complicity meant joint guilt. But Juve intervened: "Excuse me. In place of complicity, perhaps we had better say compulsion." "I don't follow you, Juve." "We must bear in mind, your Honour, that this girl is to be pardoned to a certain extent for having obeyed her lover's order, more particularly at a time when the latter had gained quite a victory over the police. For, in spite of the protection of our people, his attempt against her partially succeeded." Taken aback, Monsieur Fuselier looked from the detective to the young woman whom he regarded as guilty. Juve's outburst seemed to him out of place. "Your pardon, Juve, but your reasoning seems to me somewhat specious. However, I will not press this charge against the girl. We have something better." Turning to Loupart's mistress, the judge asked abruptly: "What has become of Lady Beltham?" Josephine was amazed by the question. She turned inquiring eyes towards Juve, who quickly said: "Monsieur Fuselier, this is not the moment." The magistrate, dropping this line, again tackled Josephine on her relations with Loupart. In a flash Josephine made up her mind. She would simulate innocence at all costs.
With the craft of a consummate actress, she began in a low voice, which gradually rose and became impressive, insinuating: "How pitiful it is to think that everyone bears a grudge against a poor girl who, some day in springtime, has given herself the pleasure of a lover. Is there any harm in giving oneself to the man who loves you? Who forbids it? No one but the priests, and they have been kicked out of doors." The magistrate could not help smiling, and Juve showed signs of amusement. "But I am honest, and when I understood something of what was going on, I wrote to Monsieur Juve. And what thanks did I get? 2 bullet holes in my skin." Monsieur Fuselier hesitated about turning his summons into a committal. End of chapter 20. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. One of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 21. At the Montmartre Fête. The Fête of Montmartre was at its height. In the Place Blanche a joyous crowd was pressing round a booth of huge dimensions, splendidly lighted. On the stage a cheap Jack, decked out in many coloured frippery, was delivering his patter. "Walk in, ladies and gentlemen, it's only 10 cents, and you won't regret your money. The management of the theatre will present to you without delay the prettiest woman in the world, and also the fattest, who weighs a trifle over 600 pounds, and possibly more, as no scale has yet been found strong enough to weigh her without breaking into 1,000 pieces. You will also have the rare and weird sight of a black from Abyssinia, whose splendid ebony hide has been tattooed in white. Furthermore, a young girl of scarcely 14 summers will astound you by entering the cage of the ferocious beasts, whose terrible roarings reach you here. The programme is most interesting, and after these incomparable attractions you will applaud the cinema in colours, the last exploit of modern science, showing the recent tour of the President of the Republic, and himself in person delivering his speech to an audience as numerous as it is select. You will also see reproduced in the most stirring and lifelike manner all the details of the mysterious murder which at this moment engages public interest and keeps the police on tenterhooks. The crime at the Cité for show, with the murdered woman, the Empire clock, and the extinguished candle, all the accessories in full, including the collapse of the elevator into the sewer. The show is beginning! It has begun!" Among the throngs surrounding the mountebank, 3 persons seemed especially amused by the peroration. They were 2 gentlemen, very elegant and distinguished in evening clothes, and with them a pretty woman wearing a loose silk mantle over her low dress. She put her lips to the ear of the older of her companions, who, with his turned-up moustache and grey hair, looked like a cavalry officer. She murmured to him these strange words: "Squint at the guy on the left, the one passing before the clockseller's booth. That's one of the gang. He was in the Simplon affair." The pretty Parisian, so smartly dressed, was no other than Josephine. The young man with the fair beard was Fandor, and the cavalry officer was Juve. The 3 now worked together. The partnership dated from the afternoon that Josephine escaped arrest, thanks to the lucky intervention of Juve. The latter had little belief in the young woman's innocence, but by getting her on his side he hoped to secure information as to Loupart's doings. Juve was talking to a ragged Arab, selling nougat to the passers-by. "Hi, sir," explained the Arab. "I have been dogging little Mimile since 2 this afternoon." "Bravo, my dear Michel, your disguise is a perfect success." Josephine came suddenly close and pulled Juve by the sleeve, and then pointed to a group of persons who were crossing the Place Blanche. Without troubling further about the Arab, Juve at once began to follow this group, motioning to Josephine and Fandor to follow him closely. The 3 threaded their way through the crowd with 1,000 precautions, seeking to avoid attention, yet not losing sight of their quarry. All 3 had recognized Loupart. The outlaw, dressed in a long blouse, with a tall cap, and armed with a stout cudgel, was walking among half a dozen individuals similarly attired. By their garb they would be taken for cattle herders from La Villette. This group proceeded slowly in the direction of the Place Pigalle, and Juve, who was pressing hard on his quarry, slackened his pace in order to let them forge ahead a little. The square, which was surrounded by brilliantly illuminated restaurants, was a flood of light, and the detective did not want people to notice him. Moreover, the pseudo cattle drivers had stopped too. Gathering round Loupart, they listened attentively to his remarks, made in a low tone. Clearly they were accomplices of the robber, who, perhaps, realized that they were being followed. Fandor, who had put his arm through Josephine's, felt the young woman's heart beating as though it would burst. They were all playing for high stakes. Josephine, especially, was in a compromising and dangerous plight. Not only had she to fear the wrath of her lover, but she ran the risk of being spotted by one of the many satellites of the gang of cyphers, in which case her condemnation would be certain. Fandor encouraged her with a few kind words. "You know, mademoiselle, you mustn't be frightened. If I am not greatly mistaken, Loupart is about to be nabbed, and once in Juve's hands, he won't get out of them in a hurry." Josephine's perturbation was scarcely quieter, and Fandor, a trifle sceptical, asked himself whether in reality the girl was on their side, or if she were not playing the game of false information. Suddenly something fresh happened. Loupart, separating himself from his companions, entered a restaurant upon which the words "The Crocodile" were inscribed in dazzling letters on its front. The Crocodile comprised, like most night resorts, a large saloon on the ground floor and a dining room on the first floor, which was reached by a little stairway and guarded by a giant clad in magnificent livery. Above this were apartments and private rooms. Just then, as it was near midnight, a number of carriages were bringing couples in evening dress, who mounted the staircase. To their great surprise, Fandor and Josephine saw Loupart make for this staircase. The long smock of the seeming cattle driver would certainly make a queer showing. What was the formidable robber's game? Juve gave hasty directions. "It's all right. I know the house. It has only one exit. You, Rameau," he went on, addressing the young woman, "go up to the first floor and take your place at a table. Here are $10. Order champagne and don't be too stiff with the company." Josephine nodded and went upstairs. Juve and Fandor followed a few minutes later and took up a strategic position at a table near the doorway. Fandor had a view of the room and Juve commanded the hall and stairway. From the room came a confused hum of laughter, cries and doubtful jokes. A negro, clad in red and armed with a gong, capered among the tables, dancing and singing. Fandor caught sight of Josephine, who appeared to be carrying out Juve's instructions. Beside her was a fair giant of red complexion and clean-shaven face, whose Anglo-Saxon origin was beyond doubt. Fandor knew the face. He had seen the man somewhere. He remembered his square shoulders and bull-like neck, and the enormous biceps which stood out under the cloth of his sleeves. "By Jove!" he cried suddenly. "Why, it's Dixon, the American heavyweight champion!" Juve signalled to the waiter to bring him the bill as he fitted a monocle to his right eye. Fandor stared at him, surprised. "Well, Juve, when you get yourself up as a man of the world, you omit no detail." Juve made no reply for some moments, then turned to his companion. "Who else do you see in the room?" Fandor looked carefully, and then made a gesture of amazement. "Chaleck! Chaleck is over there eating his supper!" "Yes," said Juve simply, "and you are stupid not to have seen him before." The profile of the mysterious doctor was in fact outlined very sharply at a table amply served and covered with bottles and flowers, around which half a score of persons, men and women, had taken their places. Without turning his head, Juve remarked: "Judging by the action of the person who is at this moment lighting a cigar, the supper is not far from coming to an end." "Come now, Juve, have you eyes in your back? How can you know what is going on at Dr. Chaleck's table while you are looking in the opposite direction?" Juve handed his eyeglass to the journalist. "Ah, now I see. A trick eyeglass with a mirror in it. Not a bad idea." "It is quite simple," murmured Juve. "The main thing is to have thought of it. Come, let us go down." "What? And desert the doctor?" "An arrest should never be made in a public place when it can be avoided.
Here, give me your card, that I may send it up with mine." Juve called Monsieur Dominique, the manager, and pointing out Chaleck to him, said: "Monsieur Dominique, please give our cards to that gentleman, and say that we are waiting outside to speak to him." In a few moments Chaleck came out of the saloon to the Place Pigalle. His face was calm and his glance unmoved. Juve laid his hand upon the doctor's shoulder and, signalling to a subordinate in uniform, cried: "Dr. Chaleck, I arrest you in the name of the law." Chaleck quietly flicked off his cigar ash and smiled. "Do you know, Monsieur Juve, I am not pleased with you. I read in the papers during a recent holiday abroad that you had pulled my house absolutely to pieces. That was not nice of you, when we had been on such good terms." This speech was so startling, so unlooked for, that Juve, though not easily surprised, had nothing to answer for the moment. Meanwhile, Chaleck tamely let himself be dragged toward the station in the rue Rochefoucauld. "The fine fellow," thought Juve, "must have got his whole case prepared. He will give us a run for our money. Still, it must..." The detective gave vent to a loud yell. They had just got to the point where the rue Rochefoucauld is intersected by the rue Notre Dame de Lorette. A cab drawn by a big horse was moving in one direction, and a motor bus coming from another. It had already cleared the rue Pigalle, and in a second would cut across the rue Rochefoucauld, when Chaleck, literally coming out of the Inverness coat he wore, leaped ahead of Juve, dodged under the cab horse, and boarded the bus, which rapidly went on its way. All this had been accomplished in an instant. Left dumbfounded, face to face, Juve and Fandor, together with the officer, contemplated the only token left them by Chaleck: an elegant Inverness cloak with capes, which, oddly enough, had shoulders and arms of India rubber, so well imitated that through the cloth they distinctly gave the impression of human arms. Juve let fly a tremendous oath, then turned to Fandor and cried: "How about Loupart?" The two men hastily reascended the rue Pigalle. They counted on standing sentry again before the Crocodile. But as they reached the square, Juve and Fandor were faced by fresh surprises. A powerful motor car was slowly getting under way. In it was the American Dixon, with Josephine beside him. Was the girl playing them false? That was the most important thing to ascertain. The car made off at a good pace toward the Place Clichy. Half a moment later, Juve was bowling after them in a taxi, calling to Fandor as he left: "Look after the other!" Fandor understood "the other" referred to Loupart, and carefully pumped Monsieur Dominique, but could get no further news from him, so, after waiting an hour for Juve to return, he went home to bed, far from easy in his mind. Juve followed the American through Bilancourt, past Sèvres Bridge, and finally into the Bellevue district, when, opposite Brimboison Park, Dixon, with the air of a proprietor, took his motor into a fine looking estate. Then, having housed the car, the pugilist, with Loupart's mistress, went into the house, which was lit up for half an hour, after which all was plunged again into darkness. Juve had left his taxi at the bottom of the hill, and, having cleared the low wall of the grounds, hid himself in view of the house. He waited until daybreak, but nothing occurred to trouble the peace and hush of the night. And then, unwilling to be seen in his evening clothes by chance passers-by, he regretfully returned to the rue Bonaparte. End of Chapter 21. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com of The Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 22. The Pugilist's Whim. An old servant had brought out the early coffee to the arbour in the garden. It was about 8 o'clock, and in the shady retreat the freshness of springtime reigned. Soon down the gravel walk appeared the well-built figure of Dixon, dressed in white flannels. He bent under the arch of greenery that led to the arbour, and seemed vexed to find that it was empty. Clearly the pugilist was not going to breakfast alone, and, to while away the time until his companion should appear, he lighted a cigarette. Suddenly the door of the house opened to give passage to a gracious apparition, Josephine.
Wrapped in a kimono of bright silk, and smiling at the fine morning, the young woman came slowly down the steps, and then stopped short, blushing. Someone came to meet her. It was Dixon. The giant, too, seemed moved. Lowering his eyes, he asked: "How are you this morning, fair lady?"
"And you, Monsieur Dixon?"
"Milady Finette, the coffee is served. Won't you join me?" The two young people broke their fast in silence, exchanging only monosyllables to ask for a napkin, a plate, the sugar. At last, overcoming his bashfulness, Dixon asked in a voice full of entreaty: "Will you always be so hard-hearted?" Josephine, embarrassed, evaded the question, and with a show of gaiety, to hide her confusion, remarked:
"This is an awfully nice place of yours."
The pugilist answered her by describing the calm and simple delights of a country life in the springtime, and, slipping his arm round her supple waist, asked her softly: "As you consented to come this far with me, why did you repel me afterwards? Why resist me so stubbornly?"
"I was a trifle tipsy yesterday," she replied. "I don't know what I did, or why I came here with you."
And then, with a touch of sadness:
"Naturally, finding me in such a place, you took me for a..."
"Sure enough," replied the American. "But I can see you are not like the others."
"And what attracts me to you," continued Josephine, "is that you are not a brute. Why, yesterday evening, if you had wanted, when we were alone together, eh?"
And she gave Dixon such a queer look that he asked himself whether she did not regard him as absurd for having respected her. "I like you very much," he said, "more than any other woman. In a month from now I shall be off to America. I have already a good deal of money, and I shall earn much more out there. If you will come with me, we won't part any more. Do you agree?" Josephine was at first amused by this downright declaration, but gradually she took it more seriously. She would see the world, be elegant, rich, well dressed. She would have her future secured, and no more bother with the police. But on the other hand, it might become terribly boring after the exciting life she had led. And there was Loupart. Certainly he was often repellent to her, but he had only to come back and speak to her to be again submissive, loving, and tractable. And, strange to say, there was also, just of late, at the bottom of Josephine's heart, a feeling of friendship, almost affection, for the stern and thoroughgoing detective, for Juve, to whom she owed her escape from a very bad fix. Fandor, too, she liked pretty well. She valued the daring journalist, quick, full of courage, and yet a good sort, free from prejudice. The more she thought about it, the more Josephine felt herself to be strikingly complex. She felt that she could not analyse her feelings. She was incomprehensible even to herself.
"Let me think it over a little longer," she asked.
Dixon rose ceremoniously. "Dear friend," he declared, "you are at home here as long as you care to stay, and I hope you will consent to lunch with me at 1 o'clock. From now till then I shall leave you alone to think at your leisure." The old servant, too, having gone off shopping, Josephine remained alone in the place, and after visiting the charming villa from top to bottom, strolled delightedly amid the lovely scenery of the park. As she was about to turn into a narrow path, she uttered a loud cry. Loupart was before her. The leader of the gang of cyphers had his evil look and savage smile. "How goes it?" he cried, then queried sardonically: "Which would madame prefer, the pig sticker or the barker?" Josephine, in terror, stepped backwards till she rested against the trunk of a great tree. Loupart carelessly got out his revolver and his knife. He seemed to hesitate which weapon to use.
"Loupart," stammered Josephine, in a choking voice, "don't kill me! What have I done?"
The ruffian snarled:
"Not only do you peach to Monsieur Juve, but you let yourself be carried off by the first toff that comes along. You don't stick at making me a cuckold. That's very well."
Josephine fell on her knees in the thick grass. Sure enough, she had played Loupart false, and suddenly a wave of remorse rose in her heart. She was overcome at the thought that she could have endangered her lover even for a moment, that she could have informed the police. She was honestly maddened by the thought that Loupart had all but been arrested through her fault. Yes, he was right in reproaching her. She deserved to be punished. As for having wronged him, that was not true. She protested with all her might against his accusation of unfaithfulness.
I was wrong in listening to the pugilist, in coming here, but in spite of appearances, Loupart, believe me, I am still worthy of you.
Loupart shrugged his shoulders. Well, we'll leave that for the moment. Just now you are going to obey me without a word or protest. Josephine's heart stopped. She knew these preambles. She tried to turn the conversation.
And how did you get here?
How did you get here yourself?
Monsieur Dixon's motor car.
And who tracked you?
Why, no one.
No one? Jeered the ruffian. Then what was Juve doing in the taxi which was rolling after you? Josephine uttered an exclamation of surprise. Loupart went on, greatly satisfied with himself. And what was Loupart up to? That crafty gentleman was cosily ensconced on the springs behind the taxi in which the worthy inspector was riding. The ruffian was teasing, and that showed he was in good humour again. Josephine put her arms round his neck and hugged him.
It's you that I love, and you alone. Let's go. Take me away, won't you?
Loupart freed himself from the embrace. Since you are at home here, the American said as much, I must see to profiting by it. You will stay here till this evening. At 5 you will be at the markets, and so shall I. You won't recognize me, but I shall speak to you, and then you will tell me exactly where this pugilist locks up his swag. I want a full plan of the house, the print of the keys, all the usual truck. This evening I shall have something new for Juve and his crew, an affair in which you will serve me." Josephine, panting, did not pay heed to this last sentence. She flushed crimson, perspiration broke out on her forehead, a great agony tightened her heart. She, so docile to Lin, so devoted, suddenly felt an immense scruple, an awful shame at the thought of being guilty of what her lover demanded. Against any other man she would have obeyed, but to act in that way toward Dixon, who had treated her so considerately, she felt was beyond her powers. Here Josephine showed herself truly a woman. While determined not to be false to Loupart, she would not leave the pugilist with an evil memory of her. She hesitated to betray him, and unwittingly proved the truth of the philosopher's dictum: the most honest of women, though unwilling to give hope, is never sorry to leave behind her a regret. But Loupart was not going to stay discussing such subtleties with his mistress. He never gave his orders twice. To seal the reconciliation, he imprinted a hasty kiss on Josephine's cheek, and vanished. A sound of crackling marked his passage through the thickets. Josephine was once more alone in the great park around the villa. Fandor and Dixon were taking tea in the drawing room. The journalist came, he alleged, to interview Dixon about his fight with Joe Sans, the negro champion of the Soudan, which was to come off next day. After getting various details as to weight, diet, and other trifles, Fandor inquired with a smile: "But to keep in good form, Dixon, you must be as sober as a camel, as chaste as a monk, eh?" The American smiled. Fandor had told him a few moments before that he had seen him supping at the Crocodile with a pretty woman. At Juve's instigation, Fandor had alleged a sporting interview, in order to get into the American's house and discover if Josephine was still there. He meant to ascertain what the relations were between the pugilist and the girl. The allusion to that evening loosened the American's tongue. Absorbed by the pleasing impression which his pretty partner had made on him, Dixon began talking on the subject. He belonged to that class of men who, when they are in love, want the whole world to know it. The American set the young woman on such a pedestal of innocence and purity that Fandor wondered if the pugilist were not laughing at him. But Dixon, quite unconscious, did not conceal his intention to elope with Josephine and shortly take her to America. Suddenly he rose. "Come," he said, "I will introduce you to her." Fandor was about to protest, but the American was already scouring the house and searching the park, calling: "Finette! Milady Finette! Josephine!" Presently he returned, his face distorted, unnerved, dejected, and in a toneless voice he ejaculated painfully: "The pretty little woman has made off without a word to me. I am very much grieved." 5 minutes later, Fandor jumped into a train which took him back to Paris. End of Chapter 22. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Three of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 23. State's Evidence.
Juve, I've been fooled.
The journalist was resting on the great couch in his friend's study, Rue Bonaparte, and wound up with this assertion the long account of the fruitless inquiry he had made at Dixon's.
I'm played out. For 2 days I haven't stopped a minute. After the night at the Crocodile, which I spent for the most part, as I told you, in search of Loupart, yesterday my day went in fruitless trips. My mind is made up. Tonight I shall do no more.
A cigarette, Fandor?
Thanks.
From the crystal vase, where Juve, an inveterate smoker, always kept an ample stock of tobacco, he chose an Egyptian cigarette.
My dear Juve, it is absolutely necessary to go again to Sèvres and draw a close net around Dixon. He needs watching. Isn't that your opinion?
I'm not sure.
Juve thought for a few moments, then:
After all, what grounds have you for thinking that Dixon should be watched?
Why, any number of reasons.
What are they?
It was Fandor's turn to be surprised. He had given Juve the account of his visit, supposing that would bring him to his way of thinking, and now Juve doubted Dixon being a suspect.
You ask me for particulars. I am going to reply with generalizations. Taking it all in all, what do we know of Dixon? That he was in a certain place and carried off Josephine under our very eyes. Hence he is a friend of Josephine's, which in itself looks compromising.
Oh, protested Juve, you arrive at your conclusions very quickly, Fandor. Josephine is not an honest woman. She may know the type of people that haunt the night resorts, yet who, for all that, need not be murderers.
Then, Juve, how do you account for it that during my visit Dixon tricked me and kept me from meeting Josephine while making believe to look for her? Is not that again a sign of complicity? Does not that show clearly that Josephine, realizing that she is suspected in our eyes, has decided to evade us?
Juve smiled.
Fandor, my lad, you are endowed with a prodigious imagination. You impute to Dixon the worst intentions without any proof. He got Josephine away, you say? What makes you think so? If you did not see her, it was due to collusion between them both. Why? As far as I can see, Josephine simply picked up an old lover of hers at the Crocodile and went off with him as naturally as possible, preferring not to see the arrest of Loupart or of Chaleck. I admit that next day she simply took French leave of the worthy American, and you may be sure he knew nothing about her going.
Fandor was silent, and Juve resumed:
That being so, what can we bring against Dixon? Merely that he knows Josephine.
You are right, Juve. Perhaps I went too far with my deductions, but to speak frankly, I don't see clearly what we are to do now. All our trails are crossed. Loupart is in flight, Chaleck vanished, and as for Josephine, I doubt our finding her again for ever so long.
All the while the journalist was speaking, Juve had remained leaning against the window, watching the passers-by.
Fandor, come and see, by the omnibus there, the person who is going to cross.
The journalist burst out:
Well, I'm damned!
You see, Fandor, you must never swear to anything.
Well, ain't we going to catch her and arrest her?
Why? Do you think her being in the street is due to chance? Look, she is crossing. She is coming straight here. She is entering the house. I tell you, in a few moments, Josephine will have climbed my stairs, and will be seated cosily in this armchair, which I get ready and set full in the light.
Fandor could not get over his astonishment.
Did you make an appointment with her?
Not at all.
Jean, the detective's servant, came into the room and announced: "There is a lady waiting in the sitting room. She would not give her name."
"Show her in, Jean."
A few moments later, Josephine entered.
"Good day, mademoiselle," cried Juve in a cordial tone. "What fresh news have you to tell us?"
Loupart's mistress stood in the middle of the room, somewhat taken aback, but Juve set her at ease.
"Sit down, Josephine. You mustn't mind my friend Fandor. He has just been telling me about your friend Dixon." "You know him, sir?" "A little," said Fandor. "And you, mademoiselle, have been seeing something of him lately?" "I happened to meet him at the Crocodile." "And took a liking to him?" "We took a liking to each other." She turned to Juve. "I suppose you distrust me for giving you the slip with another man?" Juve smiled. "You found a good companion and forgot us. There is really nothing to be angry about. Now, won't you tell us what brings you here?" "Yes, but Monsieur Juve, you must swear to me that you will never repeat what I am going to tell you." "It is very serious, then?" "Monsieur Juve, I am going to put you in the way of arresting Loupart." "You are very kind, my dear Josephine, but if the attempt is to succeed no better than that we made at the Crocodile..." "No, no, this time you'll be sure to nab him. Day after tomorrow, at 2 o'clock, Loupart is going with some of his gang to Nugent, 7 rue des Charmilles. He has a job there under way." Juve laughed. "They've been fooling you, Josephine. Isn't that your view, Fandor? Do you think that Loupart would try a stroke in broad daylight?" Josephine gave more details, eager to persuade him. "There will be 15 of them outside a little house whose tenants are away. Some of them will make a crowd to help their mates in case of danger. The Beard is to be in it too." "And Loupart?" "Yes, Loupart, I tell you. He will wear a black mask by which you can identify him." "Very well. If we have nothing better to do, we will take a trip to Nugent day after tomorrow. Eh, Fandor?" "As you like, Juve." "Only remember this, my dear Josephine: if you are putting up a game on us, you'll be sorry for it. There is a way, to be sure, in which you can prove your good faith. Be at Nugent Station at 1:30. If we find Loupart where you say he will be, we shall arrest him. If we don't find him..." The detective paused significantly. "You will nab him? Only we mustn't look as if we met by appointment. No one must suspect that I gave you the tip." Hereupon Josephine started to go. Her manoeuvre had succeeded, and Loupart's business would go ahead safely. She turned at the door and nodded, looking at Fandor. "Another thing: Loupart doesn't love you. You had better be on your guard." Juve turned thoughtfully to Fandor. "Strange! Is this woman playing with us, or is she in earnest? And how she looked at you when telling us to be on our guard!" End of Chapter 23. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. 4 of The Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Silvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 24. A Mysterious Clasp. "Hullo, hullo!"
Waking with a start, Juve rushed to the telephone. It was already broad daylight, but the detective had gone to bed very late and had been sleeping profoundly.
"Yes, it's I, Juve. The Sûreté? It's you, Monsieur Havard? Yes, I am free. Oh, that's strange. No signs? I understand. Count on me. I'll go there and keep you informed."
Juve, dressed in haste, went down to the street and hailed a taxi.
"To Sèvres, the foot of the hill at Bellevue, and look sharp about it."
Juve left his taxi cab and mounted the slope on foot to the elegant villa inhabited by Dixon. All was quiet, and if he had not had word, the detective would have doubted that he was close to the scene of a crime, or at least of an attempted one. Scarcely had he entered the grounds when a sergeant came toward him and saluted. Juve inquired: "What has happened?"
"Monsieur Dixon is resting just now, and the doctor has forbidden the least noise."
"Is his condition serious?"
"I think not, from what Dr. Plessin says."
"Now, sergeant, tell me everything from the beginning."
The sergeant drew Juve to the arbour, where a policeman was seated making out a report. Juve took the paper and read:
"We, the undersigned, Dubois, sergeant in the second squad of foot police, quartered at Sèvres, together with Constable Verdier, received this morning, June 28th, at 6:35, from Monsieur Olivetti, a business man living in Bellevue, the following declaration: Having left my home at 6:15, and being on the way to the State Railway to take the 6:42 train, by which I go every day to my work, I was passing the slopes of Bellevue, when being level with Brimborian Park, a little short of the villa number 16, which I hear belongs to Monsieur Dixon, an American pugilist, I heard a revolver shot, followed by the noise of breaking glass, the pieces falling on to a hard ground, most likely stone. Having halted for a moment, through caution, I looked to see if anyone was hiding nearby. I saw nothing, but heard 3 more revolver shots in quick succession, seeming to come from Dixon's house. After some minutes, I went near the house and ascertained that the panes of the window on the right side of the front were broken, and the pieces strewed the asphalt terrace in front of the house. I made up my mind to ring, but no one opened the door. I then thought that some prowlers had amused themselves by making a shindy, and I was about to continue to the train when I thought I heard faint cries coming from the inside of the house. Then, fearing there was a mishap or a crime, I ran to the police station and made the above statement in the presence of the sergeant." Juve turned to the sergeant, who gave further details. "Constable Verdier and I immediately hastened here. We reached the terrace of the house, but there we came to a closed door we could not break in. Having shouted loudly, we were answered by groans and cries for help which came from the room on the first floor, of which the windows were broken. We then got a ladder and climbed up. I passed my hand inside and worked the hasp of the window. We went in and found ourselves in a bedroom, in apple pie order, and in which nothing appeared to have been disarranged." "And on a second inspection?" queried Juve. "I went to the far end of the room and found stretched on the bed a man in undress, who seemed a prey to violent pains. I learned afterwards that this was Monsieur Dixon, the tenant of the house. He could scarcely utter a word or move. His shoulders and arms were out of the clothes, and I could discern that the skin of his chest and shoulders bore traces of blood effusion. On a bracket to the right of the bed lay a revolver, the 6 cartridges of which had been recently fired." "Ah!" cried Juve. "And then?" "I thought the first thing to do was to call in a doctor. Monsieur Olivetti consented to go and call Dr. Plassin, who lives near by. 5 minutes later the doctor came, and I took advantage of his presence to send my man to the station." "Have you been over the house?" "Not yet, Inspector, but nothing will be easier, for in turning out the pockets of the victim's clothes we found his bunch of keys." "To bring the doctor into the house, you must have opened the door to him, and therefore had a glimpse of the other rooms in the house, the lobby, the staircase." The sergeant shook his head. "No, Inspector, we went up the ladder. I tried to get out of the door of Monsieur Dixon's room, but found it was locked. This seemed strange, for the assailant presumably entered by the door." "By the by, sergeant, are there no servants here? The place seems deserted." Constable Verdier put in his word. "The American lives here alone, except for an old charwoman who comes in before 9. She will probably be here in half an hour, for she can have no idea of what has happened." "Good," said Juve. "You will let me know as soon as she comes. Wait for her in the garden. As for us," and he turned to the sergeant, "let us make our way inside." The two, armed with Dixon's keys, opened without difficulty the main entrance door to the ground floor. There they found nothing out of the way, but on reaching the first floor the marks of someone's passage was clearly visible. The door of a lumber room stood wide open, and on its floor sheets of paper, letters, and documents lay scattered about. Juve took a candle, and after a brief investigation exclaimed: "They were after the strong box!" A large steel safe, built into the wall, had been burst open, and the workmanlike manner in which it had been done showed clearly the hand of an expert. Juve carefully examined the floor, picked up 2 or 3 papers that had evidently been trodden on, took some measurements which he jotted down in his notebook, and, without telling the sergeant his conclusions, went downstairs again, paying no heed to the next room, in which Dixon lay, watched over by Dr. Plassin. Verdier, who was mounting guard before the house, came forward and said: "Monsieur Inspector, the doctor says Monsieur Dixon is awake. Do you care to see him?" Juve at once had the ladder put to the first story window, and made his way into the pugilist's room. The men's description was correct. No disorder reigned in the chamber, at the far end of which, on a great brass bed, a sturdy individual, his face worn with suffering, lay stretched. In 2 words, Juve introduced himself to the doctor, then expressed his sorrow for Dixon's plight. "These are only contusions, Monsieur Juve. Serious enough, but nothing more. By the by, Monsieur Dixon may congratulate himself upon owning muscles of exceptional vigour. Otherwise, from the grip he must have undergone, his body would be no more than a shapeless pulp."
Juve pricked up his ears. He had heard before of bones snapped and broken under a strain that neither flesh nor muscle could resist. The mysterious death of Lady Beltham at once occurred to his memory.
"Monsieur Dixon, you will tell me all the details of the tragic night you have passed through. You probably dined in Paris last evening?"
The sick man replied in a fairly firm voice: "No, sir, I dined at home alone."
"Is that your usual habit?"
"No, sir, but between 5 and 7 I had been training hard for my match, which was to have come off to morrow with Joe Sans."
"Do you think your opponent would have been capable of trying to injure you to keep you out of the ring?"
"No, Joe Sans is a good sportsman. Besides, he lives at Brussels, and isn't due in Paris till tomorrow."
"And after dinner, what did you do?"
"I fastened the shutters and doors, came up here and undressed."
"Are you in the habit of bolting yourself into your room?"
"Yes, I lock my door every evening."
"What time was it when you went to bed?"
10 at latest."
"And then?"
"Then I went fast asleep, but in the middle of the night I was waked by a strange noise. It sounded like a scratching at my door. I gave a shout and banged my fist on the partition."
"Why?"
asked Juve, surprised. The American explained: "I thought the scratching came from rats, and I simply made a noise to frighten them away. Then, the sound having ceased, I fell asleep again."
"And afterwards?"
"I was waked again by the sound of stealthy footsteps on the landing of the first floor."
"This time you went to see?"
"I meant to do so. I was about to get up. I had put out my arm to get my matches and revolver, when suddenly I felt a weight on my bed, and then I was corded, bound like a sausage, my arms tight to my body. For 10 minutes I struggled with all the power of my muscles against a frightful and mysterious grip which continually grew tighter." "A lasso?" suggested Dr. Plassin in a low voice.
"Were you able to determine the nature of the thing that was gripping you?"
asked Juve. "I don't know. I remember feeling at the touch of the thing a marked sensation of dampness and cold."
"A wetted lasso, exactly. A rope dipped in water tautens of itself," remarked the doctor.
"You had to make a great effort to prevent being crushed or broken?"
"A more than human effort, Monsieur Inspector. As the doctor has witnessed, if I had not muscles of steel and exceptional strength, I should have been flattened."
"Good, good!" applauded Juve. "That's exactly it."
"Really? You think so?" queried the American with a touch of sarcasm. Juve smilingly apologized. His approval meant no more than that the statements of the victim coincided with the theories he had formed. And indeed he saw clearly in the unsuccessful attempt on the American and the achieved killing of Lady Beltham a common way of going to work, the same process. Undoubtedly the American owed it to his robust physique that he got off but slightly scathed, whereas the hapless woman had been totally crushed. The similarity of the two crimes allowed Juve to make further inductions. He reckoned that it was not by chance that Dixon had met Josephine at the Crocodile 2 nights before, while the presence of both Chaleck and Loupart in that establishment was still less accidental. And already he felt pleased at the thought that he knew almost to a certainty the villains to whom this fresh crime must be ascribed. They had wanted to get rid of Dixon, that was sure, and by a process still unknown to Juve, but which he would soon discover. They had rendered the pugilist helpless while they were robbing him.
"Had you a large sum of money in your safe?"
he asked. The American gave a violent start. "They've burgled me! Tell me, sir! Tell me quickly!" Juve nodded in the affirmation. Dixon stammered feebly: £4,000. They've taken £4,000 from me. I received the sum a few days ago."
"Gently, gently," observed the doctor. "You will make yourself feverish, and I shall have to stop the interview."
Juve put in:
"I only want a few more moments, doctor. It is important."
Then, turning to Dixon, he resumed:
"How did your struggle with the mysterious pressure end?"
"After about 10 minutes, I felt my bands relaxing. In a short while I was free. I heard no more, but suffered such great pain that I fell back in bed and either slept or fainted."
"Then did you not get up at all?"
"No."
And the door of your room to the landing remained locked all night?"
"Yes, all night."
"How about this broken glass in your window, those revolver shots at 6 in the morning?"
"It was I, firing from my bed to make a noise and bring someone here."
"I thought as much," said Juve, as he went down on all fours and proceeded to examine the carpeting of the room between the bed and the door, a distance of some 7 feet. The carpet, of very close fabric, afforded no trace, but on a white bearskin rug the detective noted in places tufts of hair glued together, as if something moist and sticky had passed over it. He cut off one of these tufts and shut it carefully in his pocket book. He then went to the door, which was hidden by a velvet curtain. He could not suppress a cry of amazement. In the lower panel of the door a round hole had been made about 6 or 8 inches in diameter. It was 4 inches above the floor, and might have been made for a cat. "Did you have that hole made in the door?" asked Juve.
"No, I don't know what it is," replied the American.
"Neither do I," rejoined Juve, "but I have an idea." Dr. Plassin was jubilant.
"There you are," he cried, "a lasso, and it was thrust in by that hole."
Through the window Verdier called:
"Monsieur Inspector, the charwoman is coming."
Juve looked at his watch. 9:30. I will see her in a minute. End of Chapter 24. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Of the Exploits of Juve by Marcel Allain and Pierre Souvestre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 25. The Trap. 12 o'clock. Hang it! Just time to get there to keep my engagement with Josephine. Juve was going down Belleville Hill as fast as his legs could take him by a short cut past the Sèvres school. He cast a mocking glance toward the little police station which stands smart and trim at one side of the high road. "Pity," he murmured, "that I can't escort my friends to that delightful country house." Then he hastened his pace still more. He was growing angry. "I told Fandor to be at Nogent Station exactly at 1:30. It is now 12:05, and I am still at Sèvres. Matters are getting complicated. Oh, I'll take the tramway to Versailles Gate. From there I'll drive to Nogent Station in a taxi." He put this plan into execution, and was lucky enough to find a place in the Louvre Versailles tram. "All things considered, I have not wasted my morning. Poor Dixon! He was lucky to get off so cheaply. It would seem now that Josephine told the truth in saying he is not an accomplice of the gang." Juve reflected a while, then added: "Only it looks as if that accursed Josephine had put her friends up to the job." At the St. Cloud gate the tram came to a stop, and Juve got down, hailed a taxi, and told the driver: "To Nogent Station, and look sharp. I'm in a terrible hurry." The driver nodded assent. Juve got in, and the vehicle started. The taxi had hardly been going 5 minutes when Juve became impatient. "Go quicker, my man! Don't you know how to drive?" The man replied, nettled:
"I don't want to get run in for breaking the regulations."
Juve laughed. "Never mind the regulations. I'm from police headquarters." The magical word took effect. From that moment, heedless of the frantic signals of policemen, the driver tore along at full speed and reached the square in front of Nogent Station. "It is only 1:45. Fandor should just have got here." Juve, indeed, had only just settled with his driver when Fandor popped up from the waiting room.
"Well, Juve, anything fresh this morning?"
The detective smiled. "Any number of things, but I'll tell you later. Where's Josephine?"
"Not here yet."
"The deuce!"
"That confirms my suspicions, Juve?"
"Somewhat. I should be astonished if we did see her."
The detective led the journalist away, and the two went for a turn beside the railway line on the deserted boulevard.
"Fandor, this is the time to draw up a plan of action. Do you remember the directions Josephine gave us?"
"Vaguely."
"Well, we are now going to the neighbourhood of the rue des Charmilles. It is number 7 that Loupart and his gang are to loot, according to Josephine. Yesterday afternoon I sent my men to look at the street. This is how they described it to me. It is a sort of lane with no issue. The house which we are concerned with is the last, standing on the right. It is a lodge of humble aspect, the tenants of which are really away. There are not many people living in this Charmilles Lane, and the place is well chosen for such a job, at least that is Michel's opinion. Oh, I forgot one thing. Round the house is a fairly large garden, of which the walls are luckily high, so it is likely that even if the burglars should discover our presence, they could not get off the back way."
"And what is your plan of action, Juve?"
"A very simple one. We are going to the entry of the rue Charmilles, and wait there. When our men come up with us, I shall try to pick out Loupart and fly at his throat. There will be a struggle, no doubt, but in the meantime you must bellow with all your might, 'Murder!' and 'Help!' I trust that succour will reach us."
"Then haven't you any plain clothes men here?"
"No, I don't want to let my superiors know about this expedition."
The two men went forward some paces in silence along an empty side street, till Juve halted in a shady corner and drew out his Browning, carefully seeing to the magazine.
"Do as I do, Fandor." He prepared for a tussle. "I smell powder in the air."
Juve was about to start forward again, when suddenly a tremendous uproar broke out. "Help! Help!" Juve seized Fandor by the arm.
"Take the left-hand pavement."
The two had just reached the corner of the street where the house spoken of by Josephine should stand, when a jostling crowd of people came in sight, rushing toward them, uttering shouts and yells. Juve and Fandor recognized a man fleeing at full speed in front of them, whose face was hidden by a black mask. Behind him two other men were running, also masked, but with grey velvet. In the crowd following were grocers' assistants, workmen of all kinds, even a Nogent policeman. "Help! Murder! Arrest him!" The fleeing man was threatening his pursuers with an enormous revolver.
"Look out!" shouted Juve. "Loupart is mine. You tackle the others."
But suddenly, catching sight of the detective, Loupart slackened his pace. "Get out of the way!" he cried, flourishing his revolver.
"Stop, or I fire!" returned Juve.
"Fire then! I too shall fire!" And leaping toward the detective, the outlaw pointed his revolver at him and fired twice. With a quick movement, Juve leaped aside. The bullets must have brushed him, but luckily he was not touched. The plucky detective again flung himself on Loupart, seized him by the collar, and tried to throw him down.
"Let me go! I'll do for you!"
For a moment, Juve felt the cold muzzle of the weapon on his neck. Then, with a supreme effort, he forced the outlaw's hands down, and aiming his revolver, fired. "Help! I..." A gush of blood welled up from the ruffian's collar. He turned twice, and then fell heavily on the ground. In the meantime, Fandor was struggling with the two men in the grey masks. Juve was about to go to his assistance, when the crowd now made a rush, and the detective became the central point of a furious encounter. Blows and kicks rained on him. He succumbed to numbers. It was now Fandor's turn to help his friend, and he was about to join the fight, when he stood rooted to the spot in utter amazement. A little beyond the groups of struggling men, he caught sight of an individual standing beside a tripod, on which was placed a contrivance he did not at once identify. The man seemed greatly amused, and was watching the scene, laughing, and showing no desire to intervene. "Very good, very good. That will make a splendid film." Fandor understood. His head bandaged, and his arm in a sling, Juve was replying in a shaky voice to the superintendent of police of Nogent.
"No superintendent? I realize nothing. It is monstrous. I asked in the most perfect good faith. I did not fire till I had been fired at 3 times."
"You didn't notice the strange get-up of the burglars, and of the policeman, of that poor actor Bonnardin you half killed?"
Juve shook his head. "I hadn't time to notice details. I want you to understand, Superintendent, how things came about, to realize how the trap was laid for me. I came to Nogent assured that I was about to face dangerous ruffians. I was to encounter them at such an hour, in such a street. I was given their description. They would have their faces masked and come out of a certain house. And it all happened as described. I hadn't gone 10 paces in the said street, when sure enough I saw people rushing toward me bawling 'Help!' I recognized men in masks. Had I time to look at the details of their costumes? Certainly not. I spring at the throat of the fugitive. He has a revolver and fires. How could I know the weapon was only loaded blank? He, an actor in a cinematograph scene, takes me for another, acting the part of a policeman. He fires at me, and I retaliate."
"You half kill him?"
for which I am exceedingly sorry, but nothing could lead me to suspect a trap."
"It's lucky you didn't wound anyone else. How did matters end?"
"The actors, naturally enough, were furious with me, and I was being roughly handled when the real policeman arrived and rescued me. All was explained when I brought out my card of identity. While they were taking me to the station, the actor Bonnardin was being carried to the nearest house, a convent, I believe."
"Yes, the convent of the Ladies of Saint Clotilde." The trap had been well devised, and Juve was not wrong in saying that anyone in his place would have been taken in by it. And so, while the detective was detained at the station, Fandor, after a long and minute interrogation, returned to Paris in a state of deep dejection. End of Chapter 25. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.